Dr. Peter Singer. Great to have you today.
Thank you.
So I just want to first off touch on your principle of Utilitarianism, which was founded by Jeremy Bentham, built upon by John Stuart Mills. Just curious why you accept that as your guiding philosophy.
Utilitarianism is a very down-to-earth way of looking at the world. It talks about things like pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering, things that we all know about. It doesn't retreat to something obscure. When people, for example, base their ethics on rights, there's always the question, well, where do these rights come from? How do we know what rights people have? People seem to be constantly inventing new rights. Then how do you argue about that? Now, I think it's okay to talk about rights, but I think you have to have a basis of saying a society that recognizes these rights will be a society in which people suffer less, happier, basically, have a more flourishing life. So I think that has to be the underlying foundation for our decisions about what we ought to do.
And so that is guides more morality too, or how does?
Exactly. I think, according to the view that I hold, the right thing to do is the thing that will have the best consequences, all things considered, for everybody affected by it, or including non-human animals as well as humans, and not just in the short term, but over the long term as well. So it's sometimes very difficult to work out what that will be, but that is ultimately the best thing that we can do.
And so, going off morality, I want to talk a little bit about morality and a moral compass. A lot of people, or a lot of the perception is, at least in America, so it seems, that you need religion to have a moral compass. Obviously, you're a stark denier of that. Why so?
Well, I think that there have been ethical views that have been independent of religion for millennia. And in fact, when people want to say that God is good, I think that very statement implies that they have a standard of goodness independent of God. Because if the standard of goodness itself came from God, then you would be just saying, well, God meets his own standards. And that doesn't really say a lot. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that it's even really coherent to say that the very idea of good or bad derives from God. I think we have to have that prior to whether we believe in a God or not. And of course, many millions of people don't, but still act ethically. But whether we do or not, I think you've got to have a view of good and bad that is independent of your beliefs about God.
I've seen in some of your previous lectures you touched on this, the golden rule. Where do you think that, a lot of people attribute that to religion again, but I had mentioned that it's not really, you don't see that.
No, the golden rule is certainly something that you do find in religious text, but not just in the Judeo-Christian tradition. You find it in, for example, in the teachings of Confucius. You find it in the ancient Sanskrit writings. Essentially, I think wherever you have a civilization where people stop and reflect on the most fundamental principles about how we ought to live, people will come up with this idea of saying, treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. And that's completely consistent with a utilitarian view because, of course, we would like to be treated well. We would like to have our interests taken into account. And so essentially it's saying what we ought to be doing is to take everybody's interest into account. We would want to treat them as we would like to be treated ourselves. Mm-hmm.